You know how sometimes a news story pops up, maybe seems a bit specific, but you get that feeling it's bigger than it looks.
Hmm.
That's kind of how I felt reading about this UK Supreme Court ruling on the definition of woman. It really touches on something fundamental, doesn't it? About society law.
Absolutely. It's definitely sparked a lot of debate, and for good reason.
So we knew we had to dig into it.
Right. We've been looking at articles from The Standard and The Independent, both covering the same Supreme Court judgment, obviously.
Hmm.
And our mission today for you, the learner, is really to get past those initial headlines. We want to understand, what's the core of the ruling? What did they actually decide?
Well, what?
The what's and the why, the key legal arguments behind it. And then, of course, what are the immediate reactions? What are the potential implications maybe bubbling under the surface? Cut through the noise a bit.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into it then. So the big headline, Supreme Court rules on woman in the Equality Act 2010. Can you just break down for us exactly what the judgment said?
Okay. So the central finding, and this was unanimous, 5 judges agreeing,
Unanimous, right?
is that the definition of woman in the Equality Act 2010 is restricted to biological women and biological sex.
Okay, so for this specific law, it means sex assigned at birth based on biology.
Essentially, yes. That's the interpretation for the purposes of this act, according to the ruling.
And this wasn't just like an academic debate, was it? There's a concrete situation that brought this whole thing to the highest court.
Precisely. It all started with a challenge from a campaign group for Women Scotland, FWS.
FWS, right.
Their main concern was about a specific Scottish law, the Gender Representation on Public Boards, Scotland Act 2018. It aimed for 50% female representation on public boards.
Okay.
And FWS questioned how women was being defined for that target. They argued it shouldn't include transgender women.
Why not? What was their reasoning?
They believed including trans women could negatively affect the representation of biological women on those boards. And they also raised concerns about the potential impact on, single-sex spaces.
So the fear was twofold. Diluting the focus on biological women for those board positions and maybe broader effects on women-only spaces.
That seems to be the core of their argument, yes. And it's important context that FWS had already challenged the Scottish government on this.
This wasn't the first round.
Not at all. Back in 2022, a Scottish court actually ruled in their favor. It found the original definition used in that Gender Representation Act was unlawful.
Right, okay. So the Scottish government had to react to that initial ruling.
They did. They took the specific definition out of the act itself and issued new statutory guidance instead.
Guidance, okay. What did that say?
Well, it clarified that for the purposes of that 2018 act, the definition of woman should align with the Equality Act 2010. But, crucially, it also said that someone with a gender recognition certificate, a GRC.
Which legally recognizes their acquired gender.
Exactly. Someone with a GRC recognizing them as female should be considered to have the legal sex of a woman under that act.
But FWS still weren't happy with that revised guidance, even after winning the first case.
Correct. They challenged the guidance, too. Their argument was essentially that the term sex within the Equality Act itself should mean biological sex. They felt the Scottish government was sort of trying to redefine woman through guidance rather than changing the primary law itself, and that's the challenge that ended up at the Supreme Court.
Okay, so that sets the stage. We have what's the ruling on biological sex and the who FWS versus the Scottish government's guidance. Now, the really key bit, the why. What was the Supreme Court's core legal reasoning? Why did they side with FWS?
Lord Hodge gave the judgment. He basically said that extending the definition of woman in the Equality Act to include trans women with a GRC, well, it would lead to what the court saw as an incoherent interpretation of the law.
Incoherent. How so?
And interestingly, they also worried it might actually discriminate against trans women who don't have a GLC.
Okay, incoherent. What specific legal conflicts did they see?
Well, the court reasoned that a broader definition could blur the lines between the legal definitions of man and woman in the Act and potentially weaken the protected characteristic of sex itself.
So undermining the very basis on which those protections are built.
That was the concern. They also flagged up potential issues for the protected characteristic of sexual orientation.
How so?
For example, they questioned how, say, lesbian-only spaces or associations could maintain their specific nature if the legal definition of woman went beyond biological sex.
Right. That's an angle maybe not everyone thinks about immediately, the impact on sexual orientation protections.
It was definitely a factor the court weighed. And Lord Hodge also outlined several practical problems they anticipated.
Practical problems like what?
Things like challenges in applying the law consistently to single-sex spaces, changing rooms, hostels, some medical services.
The usual examples.
Yes, but also single-sex associations, charities, women's sports, how the public sector equality duty works, even things within the armed forces.
Wow, okay, so a wide range.
The court basically concluded that grounding the definition in biological sex offered more clarity and avoided these potential practical snags across different areas.
So a very tight focus on the legal wording within the Equality Act, prioritizing what they viewed as biological reality for the purposes of that specific law.
That seems to be the essence of it.
Now, obviously a ruling like this,
Yeah.
it's generated a lot of reaction. What have people been saying? Let's start with those who supported the decision.
Well, as you'd expect, the reactions were pretty varied, often very strong. Supporters, especially many women's rights campaigners, generally welcomed it, saw it as a really important clarification.
Yeah.
The Standard quoted some calling it wonderful, even a watershed moment.
And we saw some pretty strong statements from politicians too, didn't we?
We did. Kemi Badenoch was very direct. Women are women and men are men. You cannot change your biological sex. She framed the ruling as supporting that view. And a government spokesperson backed the protection of single-sex spaces based on biological sex, saying the ruling brings clarity for service providers.
What about FWS themselves, the group that brought the case?
Understandably, Susan Smith and Marion Calder from FWS were pleased, and other groups echoed that. The LGBT Alliance, for instance, Kate Barker called it a profound relief, especially for lesbian rights, stressing the right to exclude men, whether they have a GRC or not. Maya Forstater from Sex Matters had that quote. Cis male and female refers to reality, not to paperwork.
So it seems a real recurring theme among supporters is this idea of biological reality being key for the law, particularly for single-sex provisions and women's rights as a sex class.
That's definitely a central thread.
Well,
you also had Baroness Faulkner from the EHRC welcoming the clarity it provided. J.K. Rowling tweeted congratulations to FWS.
Right.
And interestingly, Harriet Harman, who's involved in drafting the Equality Act back in the day.
Oh, yeah. What'd she say?
She basically said the ruling correctly reflects the Act's original intention regarding single-sex spaces, but she also stressed that trans women's rights still need protection.
Okay. Bit more nuance there.
And Mims Davies, the conservative shadow minister, even called for all guidance to be checked to ensure sex means biological sex.
So quite a strong, fairly unified positive response from that side.
But
what about the flip side? LGBT plus rights groups, trans advocates.
Well, as you might guess, there was significant disappointment. That's the word used in The Independent. And a lot of concern about what this means for transgender people's rights going forward.
Yes.
The Good Law Project was quite critical. They argued the court didn't hear directly from trans people and called the ruling a dangerous precedent. They felt it effectively erases trans women from protections and could set trans rights back significantly, maybe even 20 years, they suggested.
That's a very strong reaction, a major setback in their view.
A very serious concern, yes. Simon Blake from Stonewall also shared deep concern about the wider implications. He acknowledged it would be incredibly worrying for the trans community.
But did Stonewall offer any other perspective?
They did. Importantly, Stonewall also reminded everyone that the Equality Act still protects trans people from discrimination based on gender reassignment.
Ah, okay. So even with the disappointment, there's an acknowledgement that other protections remain legally valid.
Exactly. That's a crucial distinction we need to keep hold of. But others were less reassured, perhaps. Jane Fay from Transactual warned the ruling might lead to trans people being excluded wholesale from participating in UK society, potentially creating more division.
A fear of exclusion, then.
Yes. And the Scottish Green Party called it deeply concerning for human rights, a huge blow, fearing it could erode protections and cause real anxiety.
It definitely paints a picture of increased worry and uncertainty for trans people after this ruling.
It certainly does. It highlights that really delicate balance, doesn't it, between different rights, different protections within the law. But amidst all these strong reactions, it's also really vital. We touch on some important clarifications from the Supreme Court itself.
Okay. What clarifications are those?
Well, Lord Hodge himself actually stressed that this ruling shouldn't be seen as a simple triumph for one side over the other.
Really? He said that explicitly.
Yes. And he specifically stated that trans rights are still protected under other bits of the Equality Act. He highlighted gender reassignment as a protected characteristic.
Right. We just mentioned Stonewall flagging that too.
Exactly. So the message was, while this ruling clarifies the definition of woman in this context, it doesn't remove the protection against discrimination for someone because they've transitioned or are transitioning. That remains unlawful.
That is such a critical point to keep repeating for clarity. So it's about the definition of sex linked to woman in the act, not about scrapping protections for trans people based on gender reassignment overall.
Precisely. And Harriet Harman echoed that too, didn't she? Protecting single-sex spaces and protecting trans rights. And the Scottish government, for its part, has accepted the judgment.
What are they saying now?
First Minister John Swinney said they'll engage on the implications and that protecting the rights of all will underpin our actions. So, acknowledging the ruling, but signaling intent to manage the consequences carefully.
Okay. It sounds like the legal interpretation of woman in the act is settled for now, but the framework around gender reassignment rights is meant to stay put.
That's the crucial nuance, yes. However, and this is where the independence point comes in, even though the original dispute was quite specific public boards in Scotland, the ruling could have wide-ranging ramifications for trans women's rights to use services and spaces meant for women right across the UK.
Because if the legal definition of woman in the main equality law is now cemented as biological sex, that could influence policies everywhere, couldn't it? Access to all sorts of single-sex provisions.
Exactly. It links straight back to those practical problems Lord Hodge talked about.
Changing rooms, services, sports.
All of those. Separate facilities, single-sex healthcare, sports categories associations. This ruling gives a clearer legal basis within the Equality Act for organizations wanting to maintain services or spaces based on biological sex.
Which brings us right back to that really important distinction we need to make absolutely clear for you, the learner. The difference between biological sex and gender reassignment as protected characteristics. Can we just spell that out one more time?
Yes, definitely. So the Supreme Court ruling says, within the Equality Act, sex means biological sex, male or female at birth. Simple as that for the Act's purposes.
Right.
Gender reassignment is a separate protected characteristic in the same Act. It protects someone from discrimination because they are undergoing or propose to undergo a process of reassigning their sex.
So someone who has transitioned female to male or male to female.
Right. So under this ruling's interpretation of woman, a trans woman might not fit the legal definition of woman for the Equality Act's purposes regarding sex, but she is still protected from discrimination because of her gender reassignment. They are distinct legal concepts.
Got it. Distinct concepts in the same law. That feels absolutely key to understanding the scope and the limits of this ruling. Okay, so let's try and wrap up this deep dive. The core finding. The Supreme Court says woman in the Equality Act means biological woman.
Correct.
This came from a specific case about public boards in Scotland, but touches on wider issues of female representation in single-sex spaces. We've heard the reaction supporters seeing it as vital clarity for women's rights and legal coherence, while critics are deeply concerned about erasing trans women and setting back their rights.
Yes, those are the main poles of the debate.
But crucially, the court itself and commentators on various sides emphasize that legal protections against discrimination based on gender reassignment are separate and remain in force.
That's the critical takeaway on the legal protections, yes. It's a complex picture involving deeply held views, and this is one specific, though significant, legal interpretation.
Definitely complex. So as you, the learner, reflect on all this, here's something to chew on. With this legal clarification now in place from the UK's top court, what do you think are the biggest challenges and maybe opportunities for ensuring fairness and inclusivity moving forward? This ruling gives a specific legal definition for the Act. How might that ripple out into how we all talk about and manage equality in single-sex spaces in everyday life outside the courtroom? Definitely gives us a lot to think about.